When I began this research, or when the Bureau began this research about 7 or 8 years ago, at that time I probably wasn't the most cynical, skeptical person in the United States on the effect of programs on post-release outcome, but I was certainly in the top 10%. I've moderated my opinions somewhat. Partly I go into these research endeavors in a kind of a defensive, cynical mode, because I think as a social scientist you have to go into something saying, you have no expectations, you're going to try to do the best job you can, even though I know in my heart that it's hard to not to have ideology speak to you from within. But I have really been very cynical about effective treatment programs until data started to convince me otherwise. And this data really, really surprised me. I thought, no way. So I'm kind of anticipating, some positive results later on. So how can anybody, treat people? What do? Do they drill a hole in their heads, pour some kind of knowledge in, and then they're prepared or armed when they go out in the streets? How do clinical psychologists, how are they going to do this? How are they going to change someone's attitudes when there's such a tremendous dependency? And the reason I begin this with a very cynical approach is because that arms you to look for every possible way that this thing can't work. And then if you find that it can, then you're kind of disproving or disconfirming, as we all know, the null hypothesis. And so what I want to do is I want to bring you through that set of logic that we've been working on that have led to the conclusions that we now have. And so I'm going to do kind of like a three-part lecture. In the first part, I'm going to review what is probably the motivation for doing this kind of research, and that is what, if any, is the relationship between drugs and crime. And that turns out to be a very complicated question, very complicated answer. And after this lecture series is over, by the time Dr. Peter Reuter is speaking, maybe you'll have the answer to that. I doubt it, but but who knows? We can all be optimists. And I'm not going to really touch upon. I don't think I'll overlap too much with what they're saying, but I think at least I'll show you a connection without talking about causality here. If we want to talk about causality later, we can talk about causality, but I don't have the answers to that yet. In the second part, I'm going to introduce you to why I was skeptical in the first place, what the methodological problems are with doing research in this domain, and that focus is primarily on the concept of selection bias, which I think is the most critical methodological problem in any evaluation research done in prisons, any applied setting, any applied public policy analysis. And there are brilliant people who have been working on this problem, namely Heckman, University of Chicago, Paul Rubin, and Rosenbaum, both of whom were associated with ETS. Rosenbaum has moved on, I think, to Michigan. Anyway, there are people far brighter than I who have been working with this problem, and we've tried to incorporate some of their concepts into this research. And then in the third part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about what we found. And I'm going to talk about it in some depth. And to let you know that we're really actually scratching the surface right now on this database. Just preliminarily to that, I mentioned this morning, but not everybody was there. I mentioned this morning that we began this project with NIDA funding, the National Institute of Drug Abuse funding. I may not get these dates exactly right, but around 1990, Mike Quinlan, then director of the Bureau of Prisons, held a conference on the issue of drug treatment in prisons, and he was very much encouraged by things that he had heard from proponents of drug treatment in prisons, proponents such as Doug Lipton, Wexler, and other people who were supreme advocates of drug treatment in prison, trying to persuade Mike to begin programs anew. And coincidentally at that time, Lipton and others had persuaded members of Congress that drug treatment was an essential part of prison treatment. And Congress authorized $24 million for us to begin comprehensive residential drug treatment in prisons. And NIDA felt that this should be evaluated. There had been very few major evaluations of any scope or promise at that time. There had been a few. And I think a lot has been said about this issue with not a whole lot of research. So we entered into a memorandum of understanding with NIDA, something like a grant, except it's between government agencies, and they funded this project to the tune of about $2.1 million. Why does it cost so much money? Because you have to send people out to interview inmates in their setting. You have to track these inmates. It takes a lot of people. And as I mentioned this morning, the data collection effort in this, the interviews and the questionnaires and the other data we collected on them, not all of which I'll talk about today, took a lot of time. It was very costly because, recall, we're a national organization. And we evaluated treatment programs at 20 different sites throughout the United States. And we collected information on comparison subjects from probably another 20 sites throughout the United States. So you can imagine how expensive it is to send one person out to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, collect the data, go back to Butner, North Carolina, which was our hub at the time, record the data, and do this every so often. Now, we did regionalize this. We had people in different parts of the country, but even so, to collect this data is awfully expensive, which is why multi-site evaluation studies are not done that often. So anyway, that's a little bit of background. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now on demonstrating what the relationship is between drugs and crime, and why maybe drug treatment in prison ought to be one place where we can focus our resources. And then at the end of this section, I have a slide to demonstrate what I think are some of the conclusions from this literature. And at that point, if you disagree, raise your hand and we can talk about it. If you think I've overstepped the evidence, tell me. But anyway, let's begin this story a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present some data from different series, and then I'll build the case a little by little, and then draw the conclusions at the end of this. The first information we see comes from the National Institute of Justice's Drug Use Forecasting Program, and that, I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but I think I have it written down here, in about 23 adult and 24 large booking facilities nationally, urine samples are administered to large samples of people being booked, and they're interviewed to establish whether or not they were using drugs at the time of their arrest. And as the Duff data shows, that among marijuana users, 30% of the arrestees were using marijuana at the time of their arrest, and this is the range according to the cities, to the different sites. And as you can see, kind of the bottom line there, 60% of arrestees, with a range of 48 to 82%, were using drugs at the time of their arrest, at least one drug, and that could have been marijuana, it could have been cocaine. And you can see the most commonly used drug is cocaine. Down at the bottom of this slide, what I try to represent is the extent of drug usage in relationship to the kind of crime being committed, and the Duff data shows that the highest drug usage is associated with drug kinds of crimes. Now that includes possession as well as trafficking, so bear that in mind. Obviously, if you're possessing, you're also probably using. So that's why that's higher than it probably ought to be. The next set of data comes from BJS inmate surveys, the Bureau of Justice Statistics inmate surveys, and I've represented data from 1974 to 1991. The BJS inmate survey occurs about every 5 to 6 years, and that's why it was collected. This data is collected in 74, 79, 86, and 91. The BJS inmate survey data is self-reported data. Census Bureau people go out to a huge number of state and now federal facilities and ask a series of questions, and some of those questions are related to drug use. So this is self-reported drug use, so take that into consideration. And as you can see, over time, the self-report of whether or not they were under the influence of drugs at the time of their offense increased pretty dramatically for cocaine, crack cocaine over time, from 1% to 14%. Decreased a little bit for marijuana, and decreased quite a bit for heroin. The bottom half of the slide asks whether they had used, they categorize drugs into major and minor. I think it's a false distinction, but that's the way they do it. Whether they had used any major or minor drug daily in the month before arrest. And you can see, again, people arrested for, people confined for drug offenses, and again, this includes possession, were more likely to have used a major or minor drug, although there's not a heck of a lot of difference between property offenders and people either trafficking or using drugs. This now refers only to the quote-unquote major drug that BGS refers to. That's cocaine, heroin, PCP, LSD, and methadone. And if you take the 18.6% who self-reported using a major drug in the month before arrest and decompose that, you can see that primarily they were committing crimes for economic gain: robbery, burglary, drug trafficking, larceny, other property. Just to give you kind of an advanced heads up on this, you're going to see that most crimes committed in relationship to drug use is for economic gain, and actually, by far, it's really larcenies more than any other offense. For people committed for violent offenses, 3.7% had used the drug in the month before arrest, and other drugs was 1.8%. So this begins to kind of tell the story, one of the conclusions that we'll get to at the end here. I just want to switch gears a second and talk about the relationship between drugs and violence. And for those of, I don't know if any of you have ever read Goldstein's tripart conceptualization of drug use in relationship to homicides, but he has a very, very interesting framework. He's written a lot on this, and if you ever get into the literature which relates drug use to violence, you'll run into Goldstein's conceptual framework. And what he says is, he just conceptualized it this way. He said that drugs would be related to violence, and specifically homicides, in three possible ways. It could be psychopharmacologically related, it could be related in an economic compulsive way, or in a systemic way. And psychopharmacological is that drugs, the influence of drugs causes you to become excitable, or you don't have the same sense of rationality that you would if you weren't under the influence of drugs, and so you may commit a homicide because of the psychopharmacological influence of drugs. Another possibility is, are you doing it for economic gain? And that would be similar to what I was talking about in relationship to larcenies, in relationship to other crimes. But are you going to kill because you're using drugs to support your drug habit, for example? Or is it related in a systemic fashion? And what he means here is, what is the relationship between the illicit drug market and violence? That's essentially what he means. And one of the reasons why people advocate the legalization of drugs is because they believe that most of the violence associated with drugs is because it's systemic to the illegal drug market itself. And that's one of the arguments people make. And he terms that his kind of his third part of this conceptual framework. And then he gathered evidence on all homicides. He had two different samples, a New York State sample and a New York City sample. Let me just show you briefly what he found out. Don't get too confused by the top and bottom here. In the top part, this is homicides that were drug-related. In the bottom part, it includes homicides that were and were not drug-related. That's why the percentages changed dramatically. So if you look only at homicides that were drug-related, and this first top sample is in New York State, he found that most of the homicides were related because of psychopharmacological reasons, impairment. And that the second reason was systemic. And you can see that very, very little of the homicides were for economic gain. In the second sample, which was New York City, as you can see, over half of the homicides were related to drug use. But again, economic gain was only a small fraction. And here, most of the drug-related crimes were systemic. I think what happened here is over time, he was seeing what Al Bloomstein has talked about, and that is the violence associated with the crack cocaine illicit drug market. I think that's what the different samples occurred over time as we've observed changes in homicides related to the sale of crack cocaine. I think that's what this sample shows. But again, primarily, it's one of those two reasons, psychopharmacological or systemic, and not for economic gain. When you break it down by drug, something very interesting, this will have a ring of truth to probably everybody in this room. The systemic causes of homicides were associated with crack cocaine, cocaine and heroin, and alcohol. 100% of all of the alcohol-related homicides was because of psychopharmacological impairment. So it's very, very drug-specific when you're talking about the relationship, especially for homicides.
This is the first time we've seen alcohol. In all the previous studies, alcohol is not considered a drug. For DUF, for example,
yeah.
So I needed that clarification.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. That's depending upon who's doing the research and what their interest is, alcohol may or may not be considered a drug. In prison, we treat it as a drug problem, and I have data related to that, but you don't necessarily see that in some of this data. I don't know. If you've never seen this research, I really urge you to read this stuff by Ball, Rosen, Fluck, and Nurko. And this is stuff done in Baltimore where they went out and they interviewed heroin addicts that became known to them through either police records, through going to local hospital emergency rooms, to local hospitals, to any place where they could identify a heroin addict through a referral. And then they got a large, I think it's 243 of these guys, and they interviewed them retrospectively. If there's a problem with this study, it's because I don't know how much heroin addicts can remember 10 years ago, because some of these guys are really zonked out. But it's at least it was an attempt to find out from these guys, the reported relationship between their criminal activity and their heroin use. And what they did in this study was they divided their sample into daily kinds of criminal activity, so daily theft, daily sale of drugs, daily other crimes, weekly activities, weekly theft, weekly drugs, and weekly other crimes, and an infrequent theft, infrequent sale of drugs, and infrequent other. And they actually had people in their sample who reported no crime. By the way, they did have the wherewithal to go back and check official arrest records so they could tell if these guys were totally lying about it. And they actually threw a few people out of the sample because what they self-reported and what their official records said just didn't jive. And so they threw a few people out of the sample. But look how dramatic this is. The way this data is recorded is if you have if you take 365 days in a year, and this is how many days out of a given year someone is self-reporting criminal activity for one of, either daily theft, sale of drugs, etc. And look how large, I mean, for people who are reporting daily thefts, look how large the frequency of crime is over that time frame. I mean, and this is all prorated. Some of these guys, may only have been using heroin for 3 months at a time or 6 months at a time. So this is all prorated. But even so, the difference between the high rate and the low rate is dramatic. But I think even more interesting is that during periods of addiction is when they're using drugs most of the time. There may be days they're not using it, but they're using it a lot. And then there's periods of abstinence. And periods of abstinence are periods in which they're not really using drugs a lot. They're using it occasionally. And even heroin addicts go through these cycles of high rate usage and low rate usage. And so that's really fascinating. But look at the difference between the crime days per year during an addiction period, 248.8, versus the crime days per year during an abstinence period, 40.8. I think it's 7 times, the amount of crime they're committing is 7 times larger during their period of addiction for heroin addicts than it is during their abstinence period. Now, even during their abstinence period, they're committing crime. Larcenies, they're selling drugs. But the rate of crime increases dramatically during their periods of addiction. Goldstein has also looked at criminal activity for male cocaine users, analogous to the ball, fluck, and Nurko. And so for cocaine users, the pattern is very similar. The methodology was slightly different here, and I won't go elaborate on the details of the methodology, but here it was a much shorter window. It was, Goldstein and his colleagues only followed these people for about 56 days. And they interviewed, and it was prospective. They interviewed them every week. So it's a little bit more solid foundation because usually, hopefully you can recall what happened to you in the last week. I have problems doing that, but maybe these guys could do it better. And what they're saying, over the entire time frame, the entire 56-day time frame, what percentage of the days were they committing criminal activity, what kind it is, and what was the volume of their cocaine use. And the volume of cocaine use is they weren't using it all, they were a small user or a big user. I won't go into the details of how they define that. But again, you can see there's a dramatic increase in the percentage of time they were committing crime if they were a big user above either a non-user or a small user in almost every category. Also notice that sometimes there's not much of a difference between a non-user and a small user. Non-users and small users, if they're committing crime, are committing it almost at the same rate. So again, it's not just using drugs, but it's partly the volume of drugs you're using. This is some data. I won't spend too much more time on this, but this is some data by McLaughlin, Englund, and Wilson. Doug Englund has done a lot of work on the relationship between crime and criminal behavior as well. And this is some of the data. This is the relationship between self-reported criminal behavior versus officially recorded criminal behavior of narcotics users. And this is the rates. The rates reported here are per non-incarcerated man-year. So when they're incarcerated, obviously they can't be committing crimes and they can't be using drugs. So the rates are prorated based upon the time they're free in the community. And as you can see, the relationship between the self-reported crime and the actual arrest records, obviously this shows that if you believe this self-report, the volume of self-reported crime is much, much, much larger than the official arrest records, which shouldn't surprise us too much. Obviously, the clearance rates on some crimes are very, very low. We know the clearance rates on some crimes are very, very low. And so this just gives you a flavor of what that relationship might be between criminality and officially accorded arrest. Okay, what I'm going to do is put up my summarization of this literature. To be completely honest with you, I'm about two-thirds of the way through this literature. So there's a lot of it, and some of it's really good, and some of it's pretty sloppy. But so far, these are my conclusions. Conclusion number one. There's a great deal of overlap between drug use and criminal behavior. However, there's no established causal relationship between drug use and crime or between crime and drug use. And two corollaries to that. Studies show that drug users who commit crime have typically committed crime prior to their first use or their heavy drug use period. And there are also many dependent drug users who commit no crime. So the relationship is very complicated. Some people argue there's some causal nexus that causes both things to occur, but then that wouldn't explain the order in which they occur. So I don't think we have the answer to this yet. Principle number two, criminals who become drug dependent typically increase their criminal activity. For narcotics and cocaine users, the increase in criminal activity is typically for larceny and drug sales and not violent offenses. For heroin users, criminal activity continues during periods of heroin abstinence. However, during periods of heroin use, criminal activity is almost 7 times higher than during periods of abstinence. So in other words, bottom line is, especially for heroin and cocaine, it really amplifies crime. Now, the amplification is primarily for larceny and some drug crimes, not so much violent criminal activity. Principle number three, even among a cross-section of state inmates, if they were using drugs in the month before their arrest, they typically committed crimes involving economic gain. What I mean by this is, don't forget, prisons scoop up typically the most egregious offenders. And so if you use prisons to represent what's happening in the free community, you typically overrepresent egregious kinds of crimes like violence and violent crimes in general. But even among samples of incarcerated prisoners, the crimes that they're convicted of or that they're committed for are not violent crimes but crimes of economic gain, even though robbery is kind of a hybrid between violent and economic gain. Principle 4, I did Principle 4. Principle 5, prison inmates overrepresent violent drug offenders because of the sentence they receive. I'm just restating what I just said. Thus, the drug-using prison population is much more violent than the drug-using community population. It's really a corollary to what I said. You don't want to use prison data, which sometimes this gets done, to represent what is happening in the free community necessarily. I did not do number 4, and that's kind of a repeat of what Goldstein has found. At least when it comes to homicides, the reason why there's homicides associated with the drug market is either because of the nature of the illicit drug market, or because of psychological impairment, and the psychological impairment is typically related to alcohol and not cocaine and heroin. So, I guess the reason I get into that is because, by the way, do I have any disagreement or amplification of this? Anybody want to? Okay. We can talk about it later anyway. The reason I spend time on this is because it really is a motivation for doing drug treatment in prisons. It's also a motivation for doing drug treatment out of prisons. And I have not studied drug treatment outside of prisons, but some pretty smart people have. And the claim is that drug treatment outside of prisons also can be very effective. I really don't know as much about it as I know about drug treatment in prisons, so I'll just leave it at that. So this does motivate us to try and treat people who are drug dependent in prison, if we can do it. So the purpose of this study was to see if, in fact, drug treatment, and the kind of drug treatment I'm talking about is residential drug treatment. These inmates, they're not exclusively isolated from the prison population, but they usually are housed in a separate unit, and that's why it's called residential drug treatment. They usually take their meals separately from other people. They usually recreate separately. They're not entirely isolated from the rest of the population. That would be impossible in a prison. But to the best of their to the best we can, we try to separate. It's not that there's a wall, but we try to separate the residential drug-treated inmate from the rest of the population. The clinical psychologists in the Bureau designed a 9-month program and a 12-month program. We no longer have the 12-month program except in one place, but they designed this program that was supposed to be given to inmates prior to their release, or close enough to the release so that it would still have some impact when they were released. When the Bureau first designed or first got money to increase its capacity to do residential drug treatment programs, we brought online quite a few beds very quickly, and they were going unoccupied because this is strictly a voluntary program. This is not mandatory. This is voluntary. And that presented a problem for a system that was relatively crowded. Here we are, a relatively crowded system, and we have units with half-empty beds. So they started bringing people into the program that were either at the beginning of their sentence or the middle of their sentence. And in fact, some of the data shows some people were brought into the programs that didn't really have drug problems. But we're able to handle that in the research. Later, yes?
Do you have the length of time that drug offenders served in the federal system and any median estimates on that?
Yeah, well, that's in the data, and we use that as a controlling factor. I don't know how familiar people are with the federal system, but people tend to serve long sentences in the federal system these days. The average length of stay is 6 years, and that's probably higher than any system in the country, bar none. In fact, it might be 20 to 30% higher than any system in the country. I may be wrong about that, but when I look at BJS data and when I examine time served distributions, there's nothing that comes close to that. We have Congress to thank for that. But yeah, we did control for time served. So the drug treatment specialists designed this program to center around the theory is called relapse prevention theory. Now, I'm not a clinical psychologist, and I don't fully understand the nature of the clinical intervention, but it's trying to give people cognitive skills so that and role playing so that they learn how to say no. They learn how to control their drug-taking behavior once they're released to the community. They also get some physical training. They get individual counseling. They have group sessions. They have individual sessions. it's fairly intense. We have measurement of some aspects of these programs, which I haven't included in the data yet. We want to see if those are related to the outcome. But again, that's something I'm not as expert in as I am in the methodology of this analysis. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I was just wondering if this is anything like a therapeutic community.
It is. That's another name for it. Therapeutic community is another name. Yes. Now, let's get to what I thought was the heart of the matter, why I was so cynical about previous research which had purported to show that drug treatment was effective in prisons. And it gets to the issue of selection bias. And let me just give you a quick definition of that. Processes that change the composition of the experimental control group such that, that should be there, not they, that they are different on unmeasured dimensions that may influence the treatment outcome. In other words, is there something about the process of drawing people into treatment that when you compare these people in treatment to people who you select as controls, is there something about their volunteering, or is there something about the process of drawing them into treatment that determines the outcome? Is there something about volunteers? Are they more motivated? Is there something unique about them? So that by the end of the quasi-experiment, the people you have an unfair comparison of comparing these people in the program to the people in your comparison or control groups. And let me amplify that. By the way, selection bias can operate in two different ways. This becomes very important later. You can have pressures that can increase the probability of positive outcomes, and you can have pressures that can decrease the probability of favorable outcomes. Let's say we draw people into treatment because they're the worst. They're more dependent than the people in our control group. Now, why would that happen? Well, it could be treatment providers, select people into treatment that are the most dependent, and especially if there's limited bed space, which later on there became limited bed space in this drug treatment program. So selection bias can work in two opposite directions, and it becomes very complicated at that point. I have the next panel I'm going to show you focuses on pressures that bias outcome in favor of finding an effect, but selection bias can bias outcomes in the opposite direction, in the direction of not finding an effect. Both can happen, and if you really want to get complicated about it, both can happen across the same study. Now, I thought, clever me, I thought that if anything was happening, we were getting biases that favored finding effect, that we were creaming, we were drawing the best people into our programs, the people that would be most favorable for outcomes, and that previous studies which found an effect were finding an effect because they had taken the best possible candidates. And these are ways in which that can happen. Let's say, ignore this non-drug abusers. Let's say we have drug abusers. The first possible self-selection filter is, people who volunteer versus don't volunteer for drug treatment. And as I said before, the drug treatment occurred among volunteers only and exclusively. So the first selection filter is that we had treatment volunteers. Now, we have this group of treatment volunteers, and the treatment providers then select from them an even further subset because, let's say, they think these people are most likely to succeed. So that these boxes get smaller because this is a further subsetting of these individuals. We're selecting smaller and smaller groups which theoretically result in a population that's more likely to succeed. So now treatment providers, I call this administrative selection, treatment providers then only choose people who volunteered who they think are most likely to succeed. Then we have what we call the treatment selection filter. And this happens all the time. A treatment selection filter is as follows. You've got 100 people in treatment, and treatment providers are running them through this program, and the guys can't hack it. They drop out. Or they're terminated for disciplinary reasons. Very often, these guys fall out of the study. They're not even followed. And this happens all the time in this literature. It's a really important bias that people don't recognize. And I think this is probably the most serious bias in these kinds of studies. People don't follow dropouts. They don't follow people who have been thrown out of the program for disciplinary reasons. And so I call that the treatment selection filter. And then, just to carry this one step further, you can have a transitional treatment filter. That is, if you go into transitional treatment in the community, the same thing can happen again. You've made it all the way through that point, but you can't make that last hurdle. You can't make it through transitional treatment, so there you get kicked out there or you drop out there because you can't hack it. And so what are you left with at the end of this process? A small subset of people, they call this creaming. The cream has been skimmed off the milk bottle, and these are the people who are most likely to succeed. And I think some of the reasons that we've found treatment effects in this and other kinds of evaluation studies is because of this process. I don't have a whole lot of time, so there have been 4 major programs in prisons of therapeutic communities, residential programs, which have been evaluated previously. The Staying Out program in New York State, the Cornerstone program in Oregon, the Key Crest program, which made the president's speech several months ago in Delaware, and the New Vision in-prison therapeutic community Kyle unit in Texas. And then there's a 5th that's being touted now in California, the Amity Right Turn program, but there's no data on that. There are other programs with some data, but these are the ones which most of the analysis has been done on in prisons, at least the therapeutic communities. Now, to try to compensate for the selection bias problems, one of the things we did was to follow this research design. We followed all inmates who entered drug treatment and who completed the program, who did not complete the program due to administrative reasons. We call these incompletes. They didn't complete the program for no fault of their own. Maybe they got into the program and unknown to them, they were getting out real soon, because every once in a while that happens. Let's say a halfway house becomes available for these inmates. They didn't realize it. They were 6 months through the program. They had to leave to get the halfway house stay. So these were terminations through no fault of the inmate themselves. People who withdrew, they couldn't hack it. We followed them too. As long as they entered the program, we followed them. So people who withdrew, and people who were terminated for disciplinary reasons. So anybody who entered treatment, we followed. We selected 2 comparison groups, and you'll see why this is important later. A comparison group of subjects from DAP, by the way, stands for Drug Abuse Program sites. That's what that means. We selected a comparison group of subjects from DAP sites, and we selected a comparison group of subjects from non-DAP sites. Just think about this a little bit. If selection bias is operating, and in an institution where you have a drug program, if you're drawing off the best, then who is left to compare them to? Essentially the people that are not the best. But if you draw a sample from sites where no drug treatment is available, and we're talking about people who have drug problems, then in that group you have a little bit of everything, right? You have people who would probably enter a program and complete it if it were available. You have people who would enter a program and not complete it for their own for reasons not nothing they could do about it. There'd be people who enter a program and be removed for disciplinary reasons. There'd be people who would enter a program and be removed because they couldn't hack it. And there would be people who wouldn't volunteer. So you have a little bit of everything in the non-DAP sites.
Jared?
Yeah.
The second group are people who are at drug abuse programs but not receiving treatment.
What do you mean by second group? This one? A comparison group of subjects? Yeah. These are people who are at an institution that has drug abuse and who didn't volunteer but who have a drug abuse problem. One of the reasons why this study was so expensive is we had to measure large samples of people at every site just to find out who had a drug abusing problem, because we didn't have enough good information in our automated records to identify them. That in itself was a nightmare. Yeah. Is that? Yeah. Okay. So, to combat this problem of selection bias, we did three kinds of analyses. We did the kind of analysis that's traditionally done. Well, I should say the kind of analysis that should be done traditionally, not always. That is, we compared each one of those groups I showed you. We compared the people who completed, compared to the people who didn't complete, compared to the people who withdrew, compared to the people who were removed for disciplinary reasons, compared to the DAP control people, comparison people from the DAP sites, compared to the comparison people from the non-DAP sites. That's what I call the traditional approach. And even that's the kind of thing that's done by the people who at least try to correct for selection bias, recognizing it. The second thing we did was we took a very conservative approach. We took all of those groups who entered treatment, and whether they completed or not, we collapsed them all into one big fat group. So whether they completed or not, we considered them all the same. And we even threw in the comparison subjects from the DAP sites, threw them in there as well, and compared all 5 of them to the comparison subjects from the non-DAP sites. And theoretically, what we're saying here is the comparison subjects from the non-DAP sites should be proportionally represented in all those other groups. In other words, we would expect people who have drug treatment problems to be proportionally represented in the same proportions in the non-DAP sites as they are in the DAP sites, and so it's a very conservative test when we lump all those 5 groups together and compare them to the other. Now, the third way we did this is econometric hocus pocus. And I'm all for econometric hocus pocus, except I have to be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure how this was done. A good friend of mine is an econometrician. His name is Bill Rhodes, and he's a very good econometrician. And I can vaguely tell you what he did, but he purports, the way that Heckman does it in adjusting for selection bias, he purports to be able to model selection bias at the same time you're evaluating the effect of the drug treatment programs. Now, the big advantage, you have to recognize that in order to do this, economists have to make a lot of assumptions, and I won't go into the nitty-gritty details of that. But given these assumptions, he is able to assess the effect of a program in the presence or absence of selection bias at the same time he is estimating selection bias. And for those of you who want to read up on it, I have an appendix that you'll be welcome to have. But take it as a leap of faith. I had to take it a little bit as a leap of faith. I think I understand it, but I'm not exactly sure. So the third approach was a model that allows us to assess selection, whether or not selection bias is happening, and whether or not treatment is having an effect in the presence or absence of selection bias. I only have about 10, 15 minutes, right? Is that okay? Because I think I was going to skip over some of the descriptive data and go to the results. Is that okay? I'll do a little. I'm starting to get into the data from the study, and I have a lot of descriptive data, and I don't want to, since the multivariate analysis is the important one here, I want to get to the multivariate analysis. Well, let me at least give you an idea of what the sample looks like. We do have about 3,000 inmates in the sample, but at this point in time, only about 2/3 of them have completed 6 months in the community post-release. We've been collecting data, and these are waves of cohorts. And within a year, well, probably within less than that, probably within 3 or 4 months, all 3,000 will have been out for at least 6 months, and by then some will have been out 18 months. So we're going to continue to analyze this. But of these 1,866, 1,524 were males, 342 females. It turns out, by accident, in those people who are not included in the data yet, they're predominantly female. So we will have a large enough female sample to really look at the sex differences. Right now, we really don't. So most of the results I'm going to report are for the combined sample. We had 530 in the comparison group from the DAP sites, 437 in the comparison groups from non-DAP sites, 620 people who started treatment and completed, 147 who started and were incompletes, 53 who started and couldn't hack it and dropped out, and 79 who started and were disciplinary discharged. Yeah.
Yes, so I understand. All of these people have reported some drug abuse problem.
Yes.
So it's a self-reported group.
Yes, it's all moderate to severe drug abuse because those are the only people we're treating.
Did it include your alcohol use?
Yes. Yes. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of, this will probably be the only descriptive statistic I do, is the kinds of drugs they're using. We assess drug use in many, many, many different ways. I only want to represent one way we assessed it here, and that is during their heaviest usage, what percent were using daily. That's pretty severe drug usage. And you can see 33% were using powder cocaine, 14% crack cocaine, 17% heroin, 57% marijuana. I don't have the alcohol represented here. It's in another slide. 16% stimulants. Among the females, again, drugs of choice, marijuana, powder cocaine. I have one other slide that shows the nature of the drug problem, and let me skip to that because I think it's pretty informative. The slide I'm going to put up here is really 2 slides. I can only put them up one at a time because there's too much information on them. I'm going to put up the high end first and the low end second. And what this shows is the nature between the type of drug people said that they were using the most and associated life course problems that it affected. Let me give you an example of that. This is the result of what's called a correspondence analysis. I won't go into the nitty-gritty, but essentially what we're looking at is 2 dimensions, a dimension that goes north and south and a dimension that goes east and west. And in this particular correspondence analysis, the dimension that goes north and west is really the important one. And you can see heroin use is more associated with whether or not their criminal activity level changed, whether or not they were hospitalized for drug use, whether or not they used the needles, whether or not they were drug money means were they committing crimes to get money for drugs. Were they using drugs at the time of the arrest? Yes. So on this end of the scale, drug use is associated, these factors are associated with heroin, to a certain extent crack, and a certain extent opiates. On the bottom half of the scale, these are mostly no answers to those questions. Cocaine stimulants are right in the middle. Pot and hallucinogens are at the other end of the scale, not using a needle. Their criminal activity did not change. They were not under the influence of drugs at the time of their arrest. So you can see pot and hallucinogens are embedded in a less problematic lifestyle than were crack especially, and heroin, and what was the other one? Opiates. So we have lots of ways of measuring drug dependence and drug abuse. It's not just the amount of drugs you're taking. It's how do drugs affect your life course? To what extent are they impacting on your life? And by the way, that's also, as I understand it, the DSM-3, 4. Someone who's a clinical psychologist corrected me. 4. I believe that's also the DSM-4. Okay. I think that's also the DSM-4 orientation to drug use as well. And if I'm wrong about that, you can tell me later. We also had a summary measure of drug dependence, which depends upon all those things I was showing you. So it's not just your drug use, but whether or not it impaired other aspects of your life. And we threw that all into one logistic regression and got a drug dependency scale. We did the same thing for alcohol, whether or not it impaired certain qualities of your life and how much alcohol you were using. And we threw that into a logistic regression, and we got a drug dependency scale for alcohol use as well. And those are the scales we use for drug dependence and alcohol dependence when I report the multivariate results. So I'm going to skip the rest of the descriptive statistics and get to the good stuff. I thought I had a slide to show you all the control variables we had. Either I misplaced it or I'm not finding it. I just wanted to give you a sense of the kinds of things we controlled for in our multivariate analysis. I'm not finding it. Oh, here they are. These are the kinds of variables we use in our multivariate analysis. When I show you the slides showing the results of these studies, not all these variables are in the slides because there were so many of them. But just to give you a sense of the richness of the data set. What we call the background and base values are dummy codes for the treatment effects I described. Sex, race, ethnicity, prior commitments, criminal justice status at the time of commitment, sentence length, age of release, employment status, education level, prior drug use, drug dependence, that's the one I just mentioned, which was the estimated log odds. Alcohol dependence, same thing. Drug and alcohol treatment history, mental health treatment history, diagnosis of depression and antisocial personality. That was for the clinician in the research group. And by the way, when I say prior drug use, we recorded that drug which was associated with the period of heaviest usage. What drug were they using most often during their heaviest usage, to see if we could characterize outcome in relationship to the type of drug that they were most likely to use. That's one set of variables. Yes?
One of those covered the variable covered the length of time between when they were committed and when they started the program.
That's coming up.
Okay.
The second set of variables is supposed to tap whether or not these people are ready to change their behavior. There's a lot of work done by a guy by the name of Prochaska on dependency and treatment, and it's called the Motivation to Change Assessment Scale, and we use that, and these, I don't have enough time, but these are the dimensions that we recorded in relationship to the Prochaska scale. And as you can see, I mean, they're supposed to measure the extent to which someone is ready for treatment or whether someone is actively engaged in treatment. We also had what we call additional treatment variables, and this covers what you were talking about. The top half, this is three sets of variables. The top third is additional treatment variables: time in treatment, whether or not they had outpatient treatment, whether or not they had self-help treatment, the time between DAP completion and release. In other words, how long after they completed the program until the time they were released. What we call the program maturity, and this is the one you were asking, the time between the program startup and the inmate's entry into the program. Whether or not transitional services were received in a halfway house, whether or not treatment was received during post-release supervision, whether it was self-help and contract. Then we have variables related to levels of post-release supervision, whether an individual received supervision, whether or not an inmate received supervision. Some of our sample went directly to the streets, did not go to supervision after release from prison. It's rare, but it happened. The rate of urinalysis during supervision, how often they were given urinalysis, whether or not they were placed in a halfway house, and whether or not they were placed in a halfway house as a condition of supervision. And then we had what we call post-release covariates. What cohort were they released to? Kind of a measure of economic activity. Were they living with a spouse at the time of release? Whether or not they were employed in a given month of release, and whether or not they were using drugs. These things with asterisks on them, if you can see them, are time-dependent covariates. I won't go into the gory details of that. I'll tell you why that's important. But we had time-dependent covariates. And everybody wants to know the kind of analysis we did. So for our four primary outcome variables were the month to arrest or first drug use, and we used a discrete time event history analysis, and the hazard rate was dummy coded. See, I went to University of Michigan last year and took a course on event history analysis, so I was able to do this analysis, thanks to Jay Teachman, who, by the way, excellent teacher. If you ever get a chance, if you ever want to learn how to do survival analysis, go to the University of Michigan, take a course with Jay Teachman. He's an unbelievable teacher. And then we did that for both the traditional model and the very conservative model. So we had survival analysis, discrete time event history analysis. It's discrete in the sense that we were measuring whether or not someone was arrested in each month that they were released. That's why it's called discrete time. It's not continuous time. And my friend Bill Rhodes did this fancy schmancy parametric survival model with parameter estimates for selection bias, assuming a log normal distribution. In order to do parametric survival analysis, you have to make an assumption about what kind of underlying distribution there is. And because we did the discrete time event history, we knew what it was because we could tell from the dummy coefficients, and we'll get into that later. And then we also measured CCC failure, whether or not they failed in a CCC. Oh, by the way, the primary outcomes were arrest and first drug use, CCC failure, and percent of time employed. Okay, I won't spend a lot of time on these multivariate analysis, but let me show you what we found. Because, believe me, up until the time we did this analysis, I still thought that there's no way we were going to find any effects. Okay, this is what we're calling the traditional model. That's where we separately compare the DAP comparisons. By the way, we had two groups that completed the drug treatment. those that completed the 12-month program, those that completed the 9-month program, the non-completers, the disciplinary discharges, and the withdrawals. And you know that when you dummy code, the referent group here was the comparisons from the non-DAP sites. So all these groups are compared to the comparisons from the non-DAP sites. And as you can see, there was 2 stars means it's less than 0.0. 1 star means it's less than 0.10. 2 stars means it's less than 0.05. And 3 stars, jackpot, p less than 0.01. So here, p less than 0.05, those who graduated in the 9-month program were less likely to fail. Less likely to fail according to the discrete time event history analysis. Let's just drop down quickly to this 2nd, 3rd month, 4th month. This shows you the nature of the hazard. And what... Oh, sorry. Oh. This shows, because these coefficients are increasing, these are each successive month up to 6 months relative to the first month. Because these coefficients are increasing, it shows that the hazard is increasing over time. And that justified Bill's using the log normal distribution. And this is typically what you find when you look at the hazard rate of rearrest. I won't go through the rest of these, but these are some of the control variables that we found. Notice drug dependence and alcohol dependence have no impact on the effectiveness of treatment when you measure the outcome as arrest. No effect whatsoever. Now, this dirty urinalysis, this is a time-dependent covariate. In the month that you have a dirty urinalysis, you're much, much, much more likely to be arrested. Now, no, I'll get into an argument about that later. Now, I said that's a traditional approach. Here is our very conservative approach. And this is, I expected, okay, maybe we'll find it because those people were creamed in the 9-month program. But once we collapse all those programs and compare the collapsed version versus the non-collapsed version, the whole effect will disappear. Well, it didn't really disappear. It was so close. It was p less than 0.106. It was so close that we can argue about this, but the actual p-value is p less than 0.106, and since it's a one-direction test, it's it's close enough for me, it just surprised me that it even came this close. And again, no drug or alcohol dependence, and the same nature of the survival the hazard rate. Now, this is Bill Rhodes' econometric model. And here, if you believe what he's done, he found an he collapsed all the groups together. So he took the conservative approach, but he was able to use the information from the comparisons in the DAP sites as well as the information from the comparisons in the non-DAP sites to estimate a selection bias parameter, and found that there was selection bias operating. And even in the face of selection bias, if you started a DAP program, whether you completed it or not, this is survival as opposed to hazard rate, you were more likely to be out longer before you got rearrested. I hope I'm not confusing people. The other analyses were hazard rates. These are survival analyses, but it's giving us the same result. So, the only other slides I'll show you is first drug use. Same thing for first drug use. This is the traditional approach where we got a significant coefficient for 12-month and 9-month programs, decreases the hazard. Here, drug dependence is important. Alcohol dependence is not. So the more you're drug dependent, the more likely you will return to drug use. But even in spite of that, or controlling for that, you're less likely to return to drug use if you've had treatment. This is our conservative test using the discrete time hazard model for first drug use. Here it's very significant, p less than 0.05 when we collapse all these things together. By the way, notice for drug use, the hazard decreases over time, meaning that you are most at risk to return to drugs in the first month of release. That's your highest hazard, which makes sense. Again, drug dependence is related to the likelihood of your risk of returning to drugs. And then Bill's model confirmed this once again. If you started the DAP program, whether you completed it or not, again, it's very highly significant coefficient, controlling for selection bias at the same time, and again, as opposed to decreasing the hazard, this increases your survival. Hazard is the reciprocal of survival. If you increase one, you decrease the other. So this is saying that this increases your survival, which is the same thing as decreasing your hazard. And so, again, the econometric model confirms the impact of drug treatment. And by the way, I was not the only non-believer. Bill was a non-believer. Everybody in our group was a non-believer except the one person who is a clinical psychologist. Yeah.
Could you explain the alcohol dependence?
I can't. What it shows is that if you're alcohol dependent, it increases your likelihood it decreases your risk of being arrested. I don't know what that means. I've been concentrating on the treatment variables and not too much on the covariates. Obviously, we could spend a lot of time on the covariates as well. The covariates you would expect to be related to arrest are. Everything that we know to be related to post-release arrest is related. Prior commitments, history of violence, whether or not you're living with a spouse. If you live with a spouse, it decreases the hazard of being rearrested very significantly. So these inmates got to get married. So all the things that you expect to affect post-release outcome, recidivism, in terms of arrest, did in this study. And we controlled for all these things. And even on top of that, and using the conservative tests we did, drug treatment still reduced the risk of being rearrested or of returning to drugs. Now, we still have a lot of data because this doesn't say why this is happening. This is really what we've done here, and we're presenting this. We've really done a methodological test of this. We were saying as a group, we don't really believe this. Let's do a rigorous methodological test, and let's see what we come up with. But we also have measured a lot of things that are supposed to tell us, if it does tell us, what is changing about the individual that causes him or her not to relapse and not to commit crime. By the way, notice that when we do the arrest models, we also control for drug use because, as we know from the stuff I represented, drug use and criminality are highly related. They're highly related on the outcome side as well. We also control for employment here as well because it's a nexus of interrelationships. So I don't know that we'll uncover anything spectacular or meaningful when we get to these other variables, but we're going to take the opportunity. We have a couple of social psychologists who are working with us who are looking at things like cognitive style, things like coping mechanisms, this motivation for change scale. By the way, so far the motivation for change scale tells us nothing. Tells us nothing about return to drug use after you control for these other variables. So far it's telling us nothing. But we still have a ways to go here. Oh, one final slide. One thing you can do with Bill's model or any other model is to evaluate the impact of a variable controlling for all the other variables when you evaluate them at their mean. And if we use the econometric model and look at the change in probability between those people who started treatment, whether or not they completed, and those people who had no treatment, and what is the conditional probability of being rearrested given all of those other variables evaluated at their mean, the difference in probability of being rearrested in the first 6 months is 5.6% versus 14% for people who are not treated. We also did a model using Bill's econometric model which said what is the effect of starting and completing treatment relative to not getting treatment, and the effect is about the same. It's 4.2% versus 13%. Those are quite dramatic differences. We did the same thing for arrest or for drug use, and the difference in probabilities of returning to drugs in the first 6 months for people who started treatment is 18% versus 36% for the people who did not receive treatment. And for people who started and completed treatment, the differences in probability are 15% versus 35%. So what I'm trying to say is this is fairly dramatic. This is not just a small effect. This is a fairly dramatic effect. And I mean, I'm going to have to start rescinding things I've written before because maybe treatment does work. I don't understand exactly how, but I think maybe it does.
If you look at the last two overheads, the difference between the started and completed is not that great. One of the implications would be that from that maybe we don't need to be that concerned about people who fall out of treatment, that if you can get them to start, that's the important threshold.
Well, that might be part of the implication, but in this particular study, compared to a lot of studies I've seen, we did not have a huge number of people who did not complete. If you look at Field's evaluation of the Oregon Cornerstone program, he reports that only 1 out of 3 people who start complete. So I'm not sure that's the conclusion I would draw, because if you look at especially the disciplinary terminations, these people, I didn't show you the univariate data, but these people have the highest drug dependence, they have the most violence in their history, they have the most prior commitments. These are recalcitrants that I'm not sure they're treatable even. I'm not sure. But I don't think putting them in treatment really helps. So I'm not sure I would draw that conclusion. Yeah, Dennis?
It seems that the difference, help me if I'm missing something, but you've got the people who started treatment, whether they completed or not, volunteered for a substance abuse program. Those who received no treatment did not, or did they volunteer and there were no beds available?
Some volunteered and there were no beds available. Well, the people from the non-DAP sites only volunteered to be research subjects.
I guess one of the things that I know in this business is the notion of an awareness that you need a problem is the big first step. And you've got some awareness by virtue of their volunteering. And I'm wondering, I know you've got that motivation index that looks complicated, but it strikes me this indicates an interesting selection bias, and it looks to me that you'd be better off not with the program. On both this slide and the previous slide, the probabilities of success are greater if you start with don't complete.
Yeah, well, I'd be a little cautious about that because the models are slightly different in the specific. The parameters come out slightly different, so that I wouldn't be too eager to interpret the differences in those probabilities. The parameter estimates come out slightly different each time, which is why the probabilities are a little different. I think part of the issue is going back to the conservative test that we did. That is, when you collapse across these groups, you can still pick up a treatment effect. But we did show that when we separated out the groups, if you started a program and you were disciplinarily terminated, you don't do very well. Yes?
In the rehabilitation of punishment article with Chuck Logan, treatment took somewhat of a battering in that particular article. Is there a way that your new findings support any of the things that you said in there, or is this a whole new view for...
You want me to be consistent, right? To be quite honest about that, that article didn't turn out exactly the way I wanted it to. But since I was second author, I didn't have a whole lot. I mean, I've always believed that you need treatment programs to manage an institution. I've always been skeptical or cynical about treatment, especially some of the dramatic things said about treatment, but I'm beginning to change my mind. And so I guess I am inconsistent. So maybe I'm learning, or maybe I was just saying something stupid. I don't know. But I'm definitely beginning to lean more towards treatment effectiveness than I heretofore believed. That's not to say that I don't think there's a lot of stuff that people make claims about that is just totally weird and inconsequential. And by the way, I'm still very cynical about that the meta-analysis of treatment. When that first came out, Gendreau et al. Were claiming a 50% reduction in recidivism. Now it's down to 15%. Let's see where they end up. I mean, I'm a little skeptical about meta-analysis in the first place. It's like you take a whole bunch of stuff and put it into one pot and stir it and come out. I know it's used in a lot of literature. It's used in medicine, but I think in this literature especially that people who don't account for selection bias, I think you can find consistent findings across studies just by virtue of selection bias, which would never be picked up in meta-analysis. So when it comes to results that are biased, I think you have to be very wary. So I guess what I'm saying is it depends upon the literature you're evaluating as to whether or not meta-analysis is the appropriate thing. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the studies of trend data is not predictive of outcomes.
Well, I won't. Since we had so many variables in this study, we had to have a way of selecting groups of them. So what we did was we approached this in a hierarchical fashion. We said, let's use those variables which we know are related to recidivism from past studies, and which are very important to predicting recidivism: age at release, prior commitments, history of violence. And we put those into the model, including our treatment effects. Then we said, now let's add groups of variables to see if that improves the fit of the model. That's the hierarchical approach that people use. One of those groups that we moved in was the motivation for change variables, and they made no additional contribution to the fit of the model. Now, when we moved in other groups of variables, like post-release covariates, like living with a spouse, employed or not, et cetera, those improved the fit of the model. So I'm not sure theoretically what this motivation for change scale is measuring now. I mean, we're going to give it one more shot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a study or an analysis of those variables that predict whether or not somebody enters treatment. So, for example, we know from the sites where we have DAP programs, I can do a logistic regression where I regress whether or not somebody entered treatment on those variables, including motivation for change. And if motivation for change doesn't predict whether or not you enter treatment, then I don't see how it's theoretically related to this literature. I don't see how it has any substance in this literature. If that doesn't do it, if it doesn't do it in that model, I don't know, what else does what is it supposed to explain? That's about all I can say about that.
So maybe it's theoretically related, but you're empirically measuring it the wrong way.
Well, that's possible, but this is a measure that is used in a vast literature of addiction. So I don't know what's going on. I need some expert help here. I need a good social psychologist or two who has been staying on top of this literature. I know I have a couple who are going to help me with this to try to figure out what's going on here, because I really expected this thing to do something. My friend Bill, who's doing another evaluation, said he used a similar kind of variable in a related treatment study and also found that, for whatever reason, it did not affect treatment outcome. Now, maybe it doesn't impact on treatment outcome, but maybe it determines who goes into treatment. So we have a complicated two-stage process. So maybe the second chance it'll show us something.
I don't know if that's very good. It's maybe an interesting question. Across the many sites in which was the nature of the intervention pretty similar?
Yeah. What I did not report this, but one of the analysis we've done so far is to see whether there were inter-site differences in outcome. And that was our first approach at seeing whether or not, controlling for a host of variables. So if there were different kinds of inmates, hopefully we control for that. If drug dependency was higher at one site as opposed to, we would control for that. And oddly, not oddly, but we get very few sites that are dramatically different from one another. On some of these analyses, we get maybe one site which has more positive outcomes than all the others, or their average, actually. In some cases, we get one site that's a little bit lower statistically than the average of the others, but they seem to be fairly close. Now, in the second stage of analysis, we have other variables that measure program delivery at these sites. And we'll do an analysis of those as well to see if there are inter-site differences that will lead us to understanding better intervention. Now, again, there was supposed to be uniformity in these programs, but I know that you take two clinicians and give them two programs, they're not going to be the identical programs. And, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but it's just kind of human nature, I think. But it didn't seem to make a difference. Now, it could be that for any given site, we don't have sufficient data to be sensitive to inter-site differences. And it could be that when we get to 3,000 inmates, we'll have sufficient data so that we have enough sensitivity to discover inter-site differences. So that's a possibility, too. We just don't have a high enough N in any given site now.
Am I correct in assuming that there are I don't know, are there different models of drug program intervention from which the Bureau had to choose one?
Yes, yeah. The clinicians got together as groups of people and tried to pick and choose according to their best understanding of the literature what was the best composition. At one point, there was a lot of, I've been told this, at one point when they first started, there was a lot of dissimilarities in the program, and to bring uniformity, they brought groups together and tried to design a model program. There could be deviations from that. So if they specified 1,000 hours of treatment, out of that 1,000 hours, maybe you could deviate 100 hours or whatever. I'm not sure. I'm not really expert in that.
Going the other way in terms of implications, are you prepared yet to sit across the table from the hard-headed congressman from Texas who says, given what these programs cost, are these reductions in the probability of return to drug use and rearrest and so forth cost beneficial? Can we demonstrate that?
Yeah. I haven't tackled that one yet. I'll probably need help on that one because when you do that, as you know, that kind of cost-benefit analysis is really, really tough because you have to make assumptions about the cost and the benefits. And what do you use? Do you use the self-reported data to talk about? What do you use as you know, economists have been arguing about the relative effectiveness of imprisonment versus non-imprisonment, and that's a real imbroglio, which I don't know. Maybe I'll invite you up to address Congress and answer that question.
Are there any data being collected on people who are under probationary supervision in drug programs versus those who are in your residential programs?
Yeah, that's actually part of the data set we have. Well, just to clarify, our primary interest was people going through our drug programs, but some of them also entered drug treatment under supervision, and that's recorded in our data and evaluated in our data. But we are not looking at a separate sample of probationers exclusively. Sometimes I get lost in the terminology. In the federal system, people who are released to supervision are supervised by the probation office. So I guess I misinterpreted what you were saying. No, we are not studying probationers. The probation service doesn't have the wherewithal, but the Federal Judicial Center does. Yes, sir.
Do you have any indication what the age or the average age for the people in the programs was and what the range was?
The average age of people in the
The
program?
people in the program that you studied. Are we really talking about very young offenders?
I have data on that. No, they're not very young. The average age, I know the answer, but I'd have to dig it out of my mess here. They're not young at all. They're federal inmates tend to be much older than state inmates. That's changing a little bit because of the crack cocaine laws, but generally speaking, if my recollection is right, according to the BJS survey, the average age of incarcerated adults in state facilities is about 28, and in the federal facilities about 35. Big difference. That's why we never had problems in our prisons until we started getting young guys again.
Too old to later.
Final question? Jerry, thank you very much for sharing